Okay, great. Well, this week, following on from our conversation on Sunday around loneliness, I've been able to and privileged to be able to talk to Meghan Good, who is a pastor out in Arizona. She is somebody that I've got to know through the Jesus Collective. She's on the theology circle of the Jesus Collective with me. Someone with immense amount of wisdom. We were talking a couple of months ago about loneliness in a group together, and I just realized quite the depth of wisdom she has. So Meghan, great to be with you. Great to have you joining us today.
Great
So
to be in a distant conversation with your community.
yeah, so really good to have you with us. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? What is your context out there in Arizona, other than just it's morning for you, it's evening for me, it's 8 hours difference, makes this sort of stuff really difficult. But yeah, what's your context?
Well, as you mentioned, I am a pastor in Arizona, Phoenix specifically. So this is one of the largest urban centers in the United States. Millions of people here, so it's an urban environment, but pretty spread out. My congregation is a historic Anabaptist church, so we're really focused on Jesus centeredness. And I would say a lot of people are drawn to this community, my congregation, in part because there's such a strong community atmosphere. Like it's a community that really values living life together and integrated relationships. So my role here, I'm the teaching pastor. I do preaching, writing, curriculum development, and then also oversee the kind of missions programs
Right.
for the church. And then kind of in my own life on the side, I do a lot of writing.
Yeah, right. Which is some of the stuff I think that probably got you involved in the Jesus Collective, and you've written a book already, which tells a little bit about that. What's it called, and what's it about?
Yeah, the book I already have out is called The Bible Unwrapped, Making Sense of Scripture Today. And it's a book that really looks at a lot of people I know struggle with the Bible and what to make of difficult passages in the Bible and what to do with the fact that Christians disagree about how to read it. So this book is kind of an introduction to interpreting the Bible through a Jesus-centered lens, and also a conversation about how we navigate our agreements and disagreements around what it means.
Right, because I think that is such a valuable topic and such an important thing to write about, and it's been pretty well received, I think, from quite a lot of people. And
Yeah.
yeah, and I think it's such an important topic. How do we understand the Bible together? There are some passages which either different people read differently, or we approach from different angles, or some of us just get to and go, I have no idea how to fit that into who I understand God to be, or what I think God is like, or so yeah, really good resource. And I think, I've not read the whole book, but I've seen bits of it, and just really accessible as well. Like you've not
Well, that
written
was one of
the
the
kind
goals. I didn't want you to be bored.
of yeah, so you've not written in kind of highbrow way. It's really accessible, very and yeah, really good book to read. So thank you for writing that. And now you're writing another book
I
uh,
am.
about loneliness, right?
Yes. This book kind of began in development while I was still writing the last one. But I started feeling just a real kind of burden under the Holy Spirit, in part because I was having so many pastoral conversations where I began to feel at a certain point in my pastoral ministry like the most common reason people were coming to my office was to express loneliness and their confusion about what to do with their sense of isolation, which was surprising to me, particularly because I'm a part of a community that values community, and raised a lot of questions like what is happening and why, and what do we do about it.
Right, because that must be quite a shock, right? Because I think you, like us, you're a church. We go, look, like belonging's in the small, belongs in the relationships. We do community well. We're part of our community. We serve our community. We do life together. It's okay to not be okay. It's okay to work this stuff out. You don't have to have everything sorted. We're learning and we're gravitating towards Jesus together. Like so, then right. So it must be little bit like, so why are these people coming to me saying they're lonely? Like, we've got all this stuff, and we've got all these groups, and we've got all this network, and we've got all this support, and it's okay to not be okay. We make space for this stuff. Like, so your response was, I need to do some writing about that, or I need to do some research about that, or I need to, what was your
I think a combination of both, and in part because I had plenty of experience with this topic in my own personal life, and I had questions myself about, like why do I end up being lonely even when surrounded by community? Like what are the dynamics that are unfolding in me and in others that result in this kind of, it's a subjective experience, but it's a powerful experience that
Right.
affects you mentally and physically and in all sorts of ways. And so I was kind of, I guess, on the trail for all of us to say, like, what can we learn about this that can help us maybe turn the tide for ourselves and for each other?
And this was something you saw pre-COVID, right? Like you'd noticed this even before COVID had hit. Now, I
Yeah.
like we know that COVID has only made this worse. I think our statistics are 45% of people are lonely in the UK. Um,
Yeah.
I think you put statistics out there from a study in America that was like 22% are
Yeah.
chronically lonely. Um, so it was already an issue, right? These are studies like either from before COVID or early COVID. So um, like this is an issue there that we've seen um, grow, get worse, like intensify all around us because people can't have those connections or feel are more restricted in their connections. So um, a timely piece of work in one sense, but at the same time, you're writing about a landscape that's shifting quite dramatically. Like a lot of people maybe didn't feel they were lonely before, suddenly kind of going, "What's that feeling I've got inside me that I don't? Why do I not feel so great? Why is this impacting me physically?" Right. So, um, how's that affected your writing?
That being the experience of COVID specifically.
Yeah, the COVID. Yeah, like changing the dynamic, I guess, the landscape.
Well, it certainly I started this project over 2 years before COVID began, so I had already finished most of the research by the time we began having this collective experience. But it is very interesting to see a chronic problem suddenly amplified
Mm,
really acutely. And in some ways, I think it was very positive in that the experience became so widespread abruptly that people were much more interested in talking openly about it.
right.
Um,
Yeah.
it already was widespread, and there was a lot of concern even among governments about how high the numbers are getting and the severity of the health effects. But I think the experience of COVID and social distancing just really pushed to the surface these
Right.
simmering questions about um, how we have ordered life and society and housing and
Mhm.
all sorts of things, both psychologically and practically, in ways that just make the system tremendously vulnerable and make people very vulnerable in it.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the fascinating things, and from some of the stuff that you shared with me, some of the stuff that I've gone and then read and studied in this country, and some of our statistics over here, um, and just the fact that the impact, that the health impact, and therefore the impact um, on our health services over here, or the impact on all sorts of services over here. But the impact of loneliness is more severe than the impact of obesity in the UK. And
Yes.
so, I mean, it's a serious physical, social issue because it's making people really ill, right?
Well, and also in theological terms, I think it's a serious theological issue in that it invites Christians to ask the question again, like, is the image of God, can it be fully developed alone? Or are there crucial parts of this image that,
Yeah.
like, our very physiology, our very bodies
Yeah.
remind us that, like, we were meant to be an us and not just an individual?
Right. Yeah, we have this line in our values at Yeovil Community Church that says the way of Jesus cannot be lived in isolation, which like gets right to the core of this. You're right. If we live in a society where so many people are lonely, what does that say about when we believe that the way of Jesus can only really be lived in community, and only really be lived with one or two people, with then a network of people, with then a common purpose that is global amongst the church. Um, so so then in your book, obviously you've talked about the statistics, you talked about the data, you've talked about what's going on in our societies, and I talked about some of that on Sunday, and obviously that's going to be in there as well. But then you move on to talk about So what can we, if you're lonely, if you're an individual that's lonely, then what can you do? And I think that's a really, I'd love to hear you talk about that for a little while, because great, we've identified that more people are lonely than ever before. We've identified that it's a really serious issue, and it impacts our health, and it can reduce our life expectancy by 15 years, and it can have all these impacts, and also it's not how we're supposed to be living out the way of Jesus. But actually, if I'm lonely, I mean, that's all interesting, but what do I do? How do we? Because one of the things about loneliness is we get caught in these cycles where therefore we shrink, we pull back, therefore we're more lonely, therefore we shrink, we pull, we get stuck in these cycles that actually often increase our loneliness rather than tackle our loneliness.
Right. Well, maybe we can talk about this in two pieces, because I think there's some of the work we have to do when we're lonely is internal work. Right. Dealing with what's occurring within ourselves, and some of it is external work of things we can actually do different in our behavior to make a difference. So let's start with just some of the internal things. One of the things we know about people who are struggling with loneliness is that when you are in a state of chronic loneliness, you actually read people's facial expressions and body language less accurately. Right. The reason for that is that loneliness essentially triggers like a threat sensor in your brain and your body, in which the world begins to feel more threatening and more hostile, and therefore you're prone to read more negativity off of other people. Now, this creates real difficulties, even though this is all a thing that's kind of occurring in your head when you talk about trying to engage relationships. If your kind of default reading is tilted toward negativity, you can sort of bring that into relationships and import that onto people. Now, the answer to some of that is there's no like quick and easy answer, but a kind of awareness and a kind of humility to say, like, assuming the worst of other people is usually not the best way to go in, not only for practical reasons, but because it's not accurate. In fact, that people who exhibit a higher level of trust and a more sympathetic reading of others tend to be more accurate in their readings and predictions of other people's actions. So just understanding that part of that fear, that anxiety, primes you to expect less than what other people actually want to offer.
So therefore,
in fact,
telling ourselves that, or recognizing within ourselves that, even though our instinctive response might be, oh, I think they're negative towards me, I think they're rejecting me, maybe there isn't room for me, or whatever it might be, just kind of having that little mantra that you tell yourself, going, well, that's okay, because that's probably not true. That's probably my reaction. So how do I get the strength to kind of look again, or step towards in those situations?
Well, I think like recognizing part of what you're bringing to the table is key. Another thing that I found super encouraging, I saw a number of studies where they actually surveyed people and asked just the general populace, like, how interested are you in having a conversation with a stranger today? Like, do you want to talk to somebody? And it turns out like the vast majority of human beings desire interaction, desire relationship, would like be delighted to be talking to someone sitting on the bus or whatever. The issue that they have found in research is that just no one wants to be the person to initiate. Now that has given me, as a person who has some social anxiety, like a real new level of confidence to say, like, I can navigate the world, like beginning from a default assumption that like most people would love to be talking to me right now. Like most people are looking for deep connections, casual connections, all kinds of connections during the day. It's just that we're all afraid, and our mutual fear is the wall that is keeping us apart. And I think just like being able to re-narrate the world and the people around me that way has made me much bolder, and just being willing to reach out to someone and say, hey, you seem interesting, like, would you like to have coffee? I'd like to know you. And it turns out, in my experience, almost everyone says yes. People want connection. You're not by yourself in that. And just knowing that story, I think, helps.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, okay. So there's that internal narrative that we need to challenge within ourselves, and just tell ourselves that maybe our instinctive response isn't always the accurate response. what are the other internal things that we can do?
Well, another one is to look at our expectations. Another thing that we've learned from studies is that people who are chronically lonely tend to have higher expectations of relationships than people who are not lonely. Now, I think it's important to be really careful on that because there's nothing wrong with having expectations in relationships, but I think where this can backfire on us and become a bit distorted is particularly when we begin to look for like one perfect person, whether that's a romantic partner or even a single idealized friendship, to like meet all of our emotional and social needs. And what generally happens when we approach relationships from that posture is like we're continually disappointed. Like this person seemed great, and then they didn't perform enough for what I needed, or they didn't match perfectly with all of the things that I was searching for in connection. And I think one of the gifts of Christian community, I think of it, it's a lot like saying every person is a puzzle piece, and puzzle pieces are meant to be connected on multiple sides. Like there's no one piece that's going to connect and wrap all the way around and hit everything you need and everything you are.
Yeah.
It's much more helpful to set our internal expectations with an understanding that all human needs are network needs. That it's going to take a lot of relationships of varying depth, varying complexity, different. There's some people in my life that like I never have a deep conversation with that I always know I can go to have a great time on a Friday night.
Yeah.
Like that person doesn't have to be the same person that holds all my secrets, or like setting our expectations to allow for and embrace that kind of diversity of what people have to offer, and how many relationships it may take to kind of fill the cup, helps us from damaging relationships by placing the weight of an unsustainable amount of expectation on one person.
Yeah. Just putting too much weight on one relationship, so then you have this unattainable goal for them to be perfect. I really like that puzzle piece analogy because it connects on all four sides, like you say. Like we have different needs, but we can't put all of that connection on one piece because it just won't hold. That's a really helpful analogy, I think.
Well, and I might highlight too that this is particularly relevant to people who are experiencing loneliness in marriage, because what often happens in marriage is human beings are genetically born with different levels of social need, and it's very rare for two married people to be perfectly aligned in what their level of social need is. So one person's social needs may be entirely met by this relationship, and another person may be thinking like something is wrong with my marriage because all of my needs are not getting met here. But when we understand that, like those levels are built into who we are, and it's different for each person, and we're made for network, then we can avoid even harming our marriages by expecting this one relationship to be all relationships.
Yeah, right. So yeah, so then what do we? Yeah, again, that's really helpful. And I think a lot of people kind of think, oh yeah, well if I have that one relationship, I have that spouse, that life partner. Of course they're gonna fulfill everything in me. That's what the perfect marriage looks like, or that's what the perfect relationship looks like. But yeah, you're right. We're genetically different. You know, I'm an introvert married to an extrovert. Like it's different.
Yep.
I love going to parties with her. I hate going to parties on my own, like because she does all that. She walks in, there's life in the room, like hey everyone, and she's connecting with everyone. And can I just stand there in admiration, going, I have no idea how she does that. And I'm always the guy kind of around the edge of the room having the deep conversation with one person, and she's kind of connecting with everyone. And like we have all these, but that and I think that's a really helpful observation. We're different. We have different levels of need when it comes to this. So on the internal aspect, it's about kind of understanding that our initial reading might not always be the accurate reading, but also managing our expectations and understanding all our expectations might not be met by one person. Is there another significant aspect that we can do internally before we move on to the external stuff we can do?
Well, let me give you one more. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the word like rumination, but rumination is the act where you take something in your head and you kind of turn it over and over and over, and it's like a thought in your brain gets stuck. Rumination is just generally a fairly harmful psychological phenomenon when we get stuck in it, and that's particularly true on loneliness. that the more time that you spend ruminating on loneliness and kind of turning it over and over in your head and examining it from all angles, you think it's going to help you find a solution, but what tends to happen is the thought patterns just get stuck, and rumination can actually entrench you deeper. So if you're finding yourself in a space of life where like that pain and that thought of like, how do I solve this, like is becoming this all-consuming thought that you feel like you've lost control of, um, I think it's helpful to recognize that process of it's important to think about something in a problem-solving manner, but not to ruminate constantly.
Well,
And
what's the action that helps us pull out of that rumination? Because saying, "Oh, this isn't good," but like I'm someone who doesn't really know how to turn my brain off very well, so my brain just kind of goes and goes and goes, and I don't necessarily get stuck on one thing. My mind flies all over the place. But it's one thing to say to someone, "Oh, that ruminating thing you're doing, that's not great. Like you shouldn't do that." And I might go, "No, you're right. I shouldn't do that. That's going to make stuff worse." But I might not know how to stop doing that. So is it helpful to kind of go, if I'm going to think about this, I should talk to someone else about it? That might pull to give a different perspective, or should I? What do you have ideas on what are the things we do to help us stop ruminating?
yeah, I have a few ideas. There's no, I think, one answer for everyone, but I think like if you're going to think about something, like set aside a particular time. I think it is really helpful to do it with somebody else, but even if you're not, like this is my time to think about this as a problem, to analyze it as a problem, and to ask myself concretely what actions should I be taking that might make a difference. Like I'm going to spend 30 minutes deliberately thinking toward action.
Right.
That I think for most of us, actually, especially when we're really deep in that rumination cycle, beginning to disrupt it in part like requires even redirecting energy toward, I think, putting physical activity, like anything you're doing with your body that like grounds you back in your body and requires you to think about something else for a period of time, actually kind of snags that thought rut in its tracks.
So
I know it's not easy. I've been in it, but there is a way out, and it begins, I think, with finding some productive activities that require attention and just don't let you fold inward on yourself.
Yeah.
Do it even if you don't feel like doing it.
Right. And again, if you can have someone, again, this is part of the way that we share life. If you have those 2 or 3 people who like know you, or if you have that small group where you can go, guys, like I need some help with this sometimes. So like go, okay, well then why not every week we'll go for a walk, or we'll go for a bike ride, or we'll do, whatever it might be, go for a game of golf, whatever it could be. But like what are like, so there's that network of friends can help you break that cycle as well.
Well, and I think you just did something important even in your description that you may not have been aware of, but you said every week. And I think one of the keys to this is actually scheduling it with regularity.
Right.
Because if you're lonely, if you're socially anxious, or even if you're just introverted, like sometimes the biggest obstacle is getting the thing on the calendar. And there's something that is really freedom giving and releasing when you just make a commitment, and all you have to do is show up, and you no longer have to decide. Like I don't have to decide tonight, do I feel up to this social interaction? I already decided it's what I do on Thursdays, and whether, no matter how I'm feeling, I just show up. And I think that can be a real gift when it's hard to find that emotional energy to like make a decision continually.
Yeah. And routine is a really valuable tool for us, isn't it? And all the more as we've just gone through a year of lockdown, COVID, which has decimated our routines, then finding that rhythm, finding that routine again, setting a pattern in your diaries so you have those interactions, so you have those walks, so you have those whatever it might be, is just good for our mental health. Whether you're a ruminator or not, it's just good for our mental health.
Yep.
Yeah, so we should be, if we're able to do that, we should be doing that. And so then, so you talked about the internal like narratives, disciplines, challenges, whatever that we can go through. But then but you also talked about external actions that we can take if we're lonely.
Yeah. So the first and I think most important thing, and this is sometimes the hardest part for lonely people to wrap their heads around, but one of the biggest kind of emotional disruptors of loneliness is actually altruism, or doing something to meet the need of somebody else.
Okay.
And when you're feeling lonely, like it's sort of like the black hole of emotions. Like, and this isn't your fault. Like, this is how human brains and physiology are designed. It's like being hungry. Like, your body is signaling, screaming constantly, there's a need, feed me.
Mm.
But the kind of contradictory aspect of loneliness as a feeling is that in some ways the only way to get fed is to feed others.
Wow. Okay.
And we tend to get most stuck by sort of sitting around like waiting for someone to fill the hole. And in fact, what really disrupts the emotional cycle is asking, like, where is a need in somebody else's that I can fill, even if I can't fill my own.
That's,
And that's not just a good thing to do. It actually it does change your emotional and mental experience.
that's really interesting because when we talk about giving, we talk about giving as the antidote to not enough. So when we get into this sort of psychology, which is very strong in our society, of we all want 20% more, we're all 25% away from having enough. Like so we live in this culture of not enough. Then we say, well, actually, when you get that, like, oh, I haven't got enough, things are a little bit tight, or I don't know if I can afford because I've only got that savings account there, I've only got that bit of money there, or whatever it might be. We say, well, no, like, giving is the antidote. Like, this is the way God has wired us. Actually, if you feel like you haven't got enough, giving is the antidote to that, and that's modeled in how God spoke to the Israelites when they came out of this dominant culture of not enough, of slavery in Egypt, and said, so you need to give, and you need to give your tithe, make it a habit, make it an instinct, make it this perspective, this antidote. But it's really interesting to hear you talk about that same principle, but in how we deal with hunger, how we deal with loneliness, how we deal with a lot of wherever we feel we're in poverty, and loneliness is a relational poverty, right? So wherever we feel like we're in poverty, giving is the antidote to poverty.
Yes.
Right.
And
That's
the
really
one thing we want to avoid, just as a caution, like, you don't want to put yourself in a situation where some people try and tackle a problem by throwing themselves head first in, and where, like, the goal isn't busyness, right? It's not to be frantic day and night.
right.
But it is to show up for other people in a consistent way and be putting something out.
Yeah. So in that
Yeah.
schedule that we're trying to put together, can I volunteer?
Right.
So it's not just about, oh, I'll see this friend and they can listen to my problems, and then I'll see this friend and then we can do this thing together, whatever. Can I go, well, actually, is it within my schedule? Can I put some volunteering in where I show up for someone else, where I'm a mentor for a family, or I help at the food bank, or whatever it might be, put chairs out on a Sunday, whatever it might be, but can I show up and give something of myself? I really like that.
Well, a second maybe tip that I think is an extension of that one, I like to refer to this one. I think of it with the metaphor "find a battle." One of the things we know about people is people psychologically actually, and pandemics are the exception to this, I should note, but times of like great disaster, whether that's natural disaster or war or violent conflict, in many cases the overall psychological health of societies tends to improve during that time. And the reason for that, the mechanism for that, is that having a kind of common cause, or a common even form of suffering to respond to, tends to bring people together in a more profound level of connection than watching Netflix with your friend or whatever. Like, people feel integrated, and that's a tremendous gift. Now, I don't think we want to just like wait for horror to happen before we reap the benefits of social connection. But what we can actually do more deliberately is say, like, there's a lot of big work in the world that needs to be done. There are a lot of forms of evil that need to be dealt with. So particularly as Christians, what would it look like for us proactively to like choose our battles in the name of the kingdom of God, and invite other people to come alongside us in that struggle, and to sacrifice together, and to put our sweat and blood into this labor together. And so many people find the relationships that that you might have a relationship in church, you might be in the same small group with someone for 10 years and never really know them and never really feel close, and then you go on a week-long backpacking trip or whatever, and you sweat and you bleed, and suddenly you're bonded in a new way. And I think that invitation to invite each other toward intentional action, specifically for the kingdom of God, really has the power to change shallow relationships into something much deeper and more profound in a fairly short period of time.
Wow. Yeah, that's really interesting. That's really interesting. So, we've talked about what we can do if we're lonely. I mean, is there another thing you want to say about the external, or because what you've kind of tipped into there is and also what can we do as the church, like,
Sure.
because this is a social phenomenon. Like we have, there's a large percentage of our communities that are lonely. And yeah, we've addressed, okay, those of us who are in the church who are lonely, which we know there are, statistically, there's going to be a not dissimilar percentage. What can we do? And that's really helpful. But what can we do collectively as a church to help people, to connect with people, to serve people, to bless people in our community who are suffering from loneliness?
Yeah. Well, I think my encouragement to the church on this would be to think big rather than small. The kind of things, there's small things that we can do, but the kind of things that are really going to be truly revolutionary and disruptive to a culture of widespread loneliness in the West require us to think really broadly and systematically, even about the whole arrangement of our lifestyles and how we got in the position we're in. So let me give a couple of examples. The way that we think about housing in a lot of Western countries, there have been a lot of links demonstrated to that the way we design our houses, the way we structure, the distance between our work and our home, our church and our home. The result is houses have become more and more like castles, where everyone is kind of shut up in their own private space. Nobody interferes with each other's space, and um, you can see how we got there because human beings we like owning things. We like having control of a space. But what if it turns out that our way of thinking of housing and like every individual in their own apartment and every nuclear family in their own house, commuting to church once a week, what if that turns out to be not at all conducive to human flourishing? Like, what would it look like for the church to think differently about in very practical ways about how we order our space, where we live, who we live with. Um, I will give one example, just speaking from myself here. I had my own apartment when this pandemic started. It wasn't like my ideal living situation, but that's kind of how we do things in the West. And it turned out that the level of isolation that was involved in COVID and not seeing colleagues at work and not seeing friends, like that became a really unsustainable, unhealthy living situation for me. And I got an invitation from an 86-year-old woman who has some health problems to move into her large house in a different part of the city and, help her with just small daily tasks and that kind of thing. But it ended up being, we are able to share rent, so it changed the financial situation. But much more importantly, like for both of us, it just was a tremendously positive social experience during COVID to be living together and leaving room for each other's different phases of life and different lifestyles, but also being under one roof and having meals together occasionally. And I think we've been very uncreative culturally, and the church has not been any more creative than the culture in thinking about things don't have to be the way they are. Like we haven't always done housing the way we do it now, and if we were open to thinking creatively and taking more risks on each other, I think there could be a lot more joy and a lot more connection for a lot of us.
Yeah. So big, like thinking systemic, not just oh, we should do this project or we should have this initiative, and then maybe we'll come on to that, but actually thinking what are the systems that we're part of, that we buy into, that we participate in, that are not conducive or that are perpetuating the loneliness that's in our community, or creating more loneliness in our community. Yeah. Okay.
Another thing I think we can and should have a widespread conversation about in the church is how we think and talk about leisure. It turns out that there's a range of ways we can spend our leisure, and some of those things are more life-giving than other things,
Okay.
and they're often not the ones that we're choosing by default. And it's funny because I feel like I've been in the church a long time, and we have a lot of conversations about Christian faith and work, and like how and Christian faith and family. But I've heard very few conversations about our relationship to leisure as people of Jesus, and what would it look like for us to think about patterns of leisure and the ways that we spend our time that are deliberately structured toward relationship rather than toward isolation.
Okay.
Um,
So can you
I
talk that out
I
a little
can't tell you how.
bit?
I'm
Can you,
sorry.
yeah, can you talk that out a little bit? Because obviously for us, leisure, leisure for you, leisure for us, but it's like, so you're talking about what we do with our social time, what we do with our free time. What do we, what are we spending? Are we watching TV? Are we reading books? Are we hanging out with friends? Are we, but what, what are the helpful questions that we should be asking ourselves in that? What sort of examples do you have of how we could be doing that better?
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't think it will be a shock to anyone what I would say part of our problem is. But there's a lot of evidence like over the last 40 years, like an increasing amount of our time is being devoted to television viewing in all its forms. And what's even interesting within that is that it's not just the viewing of television, but with laptops and Netflix and everything, like even television viewing used to be more communal and has become more and more individual, like every family member in their own room with their iPad or whatever they're viewing on.
Right.
Um, and I really think like how we grapple with our viewing of television is a serious spiritual question. And it's one of those many questions that it's not about is TV good or evil, but it's about like all of my time is God's, and all of my time is formational, and like is this giving God and the kingdom of God and also me like the kind of richness of human experience that God has designed for me. We know specifically in relation to loneliness that a lot of people, when they're lonely, watch TV in part because even connecting with television characters gives people the illusion of connection, even though the person involved is fictional. And I've experienced that too, but I think that's something we want to watch in ourselves. And
Because we feel invested in a character, or we feel in like, so we feel like, or maybe we can process our own issues through seeing how, or we can distract ourselves from our own issues, or we can process, we like kind of live vicariously maybe through some of our characters that we watch on TV.
absolutely.
Right.
And why do we do it? I think part of it, I talked to a lot of people about this, where they come home from work and they would love to see their friends and have a conversation, but people say like, I don't want to have to clean my bathroom, or I don't have the energy to like cook a meal and have people over for a meal. So we have all these kind of social expectations that get layered between our ability to make connections by making it just like practically feel impossible to cross the barrier. And I think we can deal with that communally by actually releasing some of those expectations and having conversations together to say to each other like, I want you to be able to drop over on like Monday or Tuesday nights, the door is open, and like I can't promise you the toilet will be scrubbed, and I can't promise you that there will be any food outside of the pretzel jar. But like I want us to be able to like sit and just like
Yeah.
speak or not speak, do or not do. And yeah, like creating a communal culture that makes that feel viable rather than having to
Yeah.
our
Right.
perform our
Yeah, it's
home life
interesting.
for each other.
So years ago now, I was youth leader, and when I was youth leader, we always used to say, look, there were certain like young people or people in the church, whatever, we'd say, just come over whenever. And look, like rock up anytime. There was a couple we even gave keys to and just went, just show up. And if you want to walk in, walk in. And like, and you might get a cup of tea put in your hand. You might get a cloth put in your hand, and you can help us clean the kitchen, or you can help us tidy. Or you might get a paintbrush put in your hand if we're decorating, a room or whatever. But just come and share life. And for a lot of young people, that was really valuable. But it's interesting that probably at our stage of life now, and our kids at different ages, a lot of them moved on, whatever. Like we, as you're saying that, I'm kind of reflecting, going, we don't do that as much now. It's like it's a bit more of an ordered social life. It's a bit more of like, and there's some real value to, and actually there's a vulnerability that maybe leads to a vulnerability in other areas of just going, well, come and find us however we are. like just rock up. If you need to knock on the door, walk in, like just rock up and knock on the door. Like, and there's a vulnerability in that might also lead to a deeper vulnerability in our emotional relationships.
Absolutely. And this doesn't have to be always in extremes. Like you
Right.
don't have to like offer yourself as available all the time. But in our community, there's one group, for example, that Monday nights, they just take turns saying like somebody's home is open and you can come or not come, right? Like it's not a thing that has to be scheduled, but like you can show up in the evening and there will be people and there will be something to snack on. And you can make your patterns known and begin to build in. What you're doing is building a new rhythm of life, right?
Yeah.
That is structured for people, rather than for other things.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay, so then how we manage our social time, how we think about the big issues in our society, and so as a church we can think systemically, not just project wise. And obviously there are projects that we can get and we do get involved in as well in some of these areas around loneliness and connection and families, etc. We do some of that stuff, but it's interesting to you talk about, well, yeah, but think systemically. I like that. Think socially, and what are the habits that we have? How open are we to those sorts of things? Yeah, is that would you say those are the two main things, or is there something else you want to challenge us as a church to think about, to step into?
Well, I think maybe one more thing I would say, this is a challenge particularly to teachers, but it's relevant to everyone. I think we need to really be talking differently in the church about family. And that some of Jesus's most radical and controversial teachings in the first century Jewish world were around the ways that he talked about family and some of the things he said about it. And Jesus had a very kind of revolutionary view of what it meant to be a Christian community that is being reconstituted into a new family by the shared blood and DNA of Jesus, into something different than what we're just born into. Now, I think what's really ironic historically is that in more recent centuries, in some ways, Christians have been the guardians of biological family as a unit of good. And not to take anything away from that, our biological families have tremendous shaping power and are important. But I think we have really underestimated the radicality of Jesus's vision of what core Christian units are to be and what we're meant to be to each other. And that rediscovering this vision of family constituted in a different way is going to be really key to even presenting the gospel in a viable way in a situation where more and more people are not in traditionally constituted family situations and are really yearning for all of the things those connections involve: commitment to showing up, security, financial support, child rearing support, intergenerational wisdom and connection, like all of those things we associate with family. I think the church has an opportunity to speak to. And honestly, if the church doesn't, I don't know who will. Like, I really think this is our opening. Like, if we don't speak to this, nobody is in a position to speak to it.
Wow, that's a great challenge, and maybe we can talk about that again a little time in the future. But yeah, I love that. Meghan, that has been really valuable, really helpful. I guess one last question before we end this conversation. We have seen over here COVID have a disproportionate impact on young people, on teenagers, and particularly on their mental health, but on their well-being, in all sorts of ways. And we've talked about how we as a church can help think about what we can do as a church for our community. We've talked about what we can do as individuals who are feeling lonely, and what can we do. Do you have any specific thoughts? I mean, maybe about why it's impacted that age group so much, but more about are there things that we can change in the church about how we serve our community, or about how we just operate differently, to counteract some of that suffering that they're going through, some of the challenges they're going through.
I'm not exactly sure about the COVID effect on young adults, but what I can say from having seen the numbers prior to COVID, loneliness numbers have been high among young adults for a while, and nobody is exactly sure why. Like we know loneliness spikes in older age, and we have plenty of ideas of what the mechanisms of that are. But the second highest rates are among teens and young adults. There's a lot of, I think, talk that is probably worth something, that part of this is the impact of technology on young adults. That a lot of us, I mean, even, my age, who grew up with a lot of tech, like, think we're getting more out of technological relationships than we're actually getting. It turns out, like, bodies need bodies. And you can gain positive social connections through technology, but it's not the same. Your body doesn't receive it in the same way as physical connection. And it's not just that more of, for teens and young adults, that more connection is happening in digital ways, but it's happening such that young adults are reporting feeling increasingly uncomfortable and not knowing how to navigate in-person interactions. So the getting used to technology essentially is creating more social anxiety in interpersonal relationships, that makes it harder to connect outside technology. And there are other things we could even say about the ways we perform and manufacture who we are in technology, and we lose control. We become vulnerable when we're in person and we're live. All of those are really significant challenges that young adults are navigating, that are the result of major technological shifts and cultural shifts that they didn't control, and that generations before them didn't have a lot answers for them on. Like, it just kind of happened. I don't know what the perfect answer is, but I think we need to be a part of conversations with young adults about that experience, and what they're finding and what they're seeking, and where that hunger and yearning is.
Yeah.
I mean, and recognizing.
Sorry, I was going to say,
Sorry, go ahead.
I wonder whether cross-generational is something, cross-generational relationships. Like you were talking before about how Jesus talks about families, but also what some of the things we get from families, and that cross-generational wisdom, that cross-generational connection, stories being told, passed on down through generations. And maybe that's something the church can has opportunities to be part of that haven't, that maybe some of our young people have less opportunity to experience in their own settings. And I think as well, again, looking at the systemic question that you raised, about, we have to think systemically about loneliness, but also it seems to me that this generation are growing up in a world that they're more keenly aware of the challenges we face globally, environmentally, financially, all the different global challenges that we face, health-wise, etc. And so how do we give them space to voice that, and to stand with them, to work with them, to challenge it, because they're the ones most keenly affected about that, I guess. So maybe some of the solutions are in that too.
Well, and I think you could tie that back to what I said earlier about finding a battle. Like, maybe part of it is inviting teenagers into meaningful work, faith-based work that matters, is a bridge to a relationship that, even if they might not sit across the table and, like, look you in the eye and spill their secrets, like, that's a hard thing to do. But struggling side by side with someone for something that matters, opens a lot of doors for connection and for sharing that might not be available otherwise.
Yeah.
One other tip I would give, one of the most interesting studies I've seen was that people who talk to somebody else with a cell phone on the table feel significantly less connected, even if they're not interrupted by the phone. Because part of what bringing a phone into conversations, it introduces this, there might be something more important that comes than you.
Right.
that kind of message. So when you're spending time with teens and young adults, I think one of the things we can do for them is like put the phone away, like put it on silent, stick it in your bag, and give your full attention. Because attention is a powerful tool for all people, but particularly for teens and young adults to know that they're being fully attended to, and um, in a non-interruptible, nothing better going on than you fashion.
Wow, that's really interesting. And just anecdotally, I chair of governors at a school in our town as well, and we took a policy decision a couple of years ago now to ban all mobile phones um, in classrooms, but on site, so they could have them in the bags, but no, like they couldn't have them out of the bags at all. But it was the same for everybody on site, so all the teachers, all the staff, any visitors to site. No one was allowed to have a mobile phone on site that they used, and the impact that we saw, yes, behaviorally, yes, attention wise, but also in social skills that develop between the young people, their ability to socialize, the ability to have conversations, the ability to listen to each other, their ability to concentrate for longer spans, all those sorts of things were significantly impacted by it. So maybe that relates to some of what you're saying too.
Absolutely.
Really interesting. Meghan, thank you so much. You've been really generous with your time, really generous with your wisdom and your experience in this area. Just really want to thank you. Really enjoying connecting with you through Jesus Collective and getting to know your work a little bit more. Do let us know when your book comes out. I think there's going to be quite a few people interested in it over this side as well. But yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time.